Chapter 1. The letter that could have changed the empire. Imagine the Roman Empire at its height. Magnificent roads connecting cities and provinces, a vast army whose glory echoed around the world, and a powerful emperor ruling the state from the heights of his throne. Emperor Tiberius, who ruled with an iron fist and maintained order despite complex political intrigues. But no matter how great Rome was, unrest and rebellions often flared up in its provinces, and one of the most troubled territories was Judea. Now imagine that the emperor received a letter from the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, a man who commanded Judea and was responsible for maintaining peace in this restless province. The letter begins with an official greeting, as protocol dictates, but then transitions into a description of troubling events that could not leave even a ruler like Tiberius indifferent. Have you ever wondered what could make a person in power wash their hands and refuse responsibility? Pilate, a man standing at a crossroads, describes the unusual events that compelled him to do just that. His letter does not simply list facts, it expresses concern and perhaps even fear about what was happening in Jerusalem. Pilate starts by describing Jerusalem, a city filled with spiritual power, tension, and irreconcilable contradictions. Can you imagine? A city where the danger of uprisings always loomed. Where local leaders were constantly engaged in political and religious games. A city on the brink of chaos, where even Roman authorities struggled to maintain control. Pilate explains how his banquet, organized for the local nobility, failed, and this was the first sign that he would have to contend not only with rebellions but also with religious leaders. They demonstrated that they could challenge his authority, and this marked the beginning of a tense period that ultimately led him to a meeting with a man whose fate would change the world, Jesus of Nazareth. But who is this Jesus? Pilate admits that at first, he paid little attention to rumors of the new preacher gathering crowds in Galilee. After all, there had been many prophets and insurgents in Judea. Yet the rumors grew more persistent. One day, according to Pilate, he ordered his secretary, a man who spoke the local languages, to infiltrate the crowd and find out what this man was preaching. When the secretary returned, his words were unexpected. "I have never heard anything like it." This statement caught Pilate's attention, and he began to pay more attention to this Jesus. There was something different about him. Not political agitation, not calls for rebellion, but something deeper, spiritual. Can you imagine the growing concern Pilate must have felt at that moment? He stood at a dilemma: what to do with a man whose influence over the people was growing day by day but who did not call for outright rebellion against Rome. But what could there be in this Jesus that even a man like Pilate could begin to doubt? After all, Pilate was a tough man used to resolving everything with force. What was happening in Jerusalem that made him contemplate? In this first chapter, we merely touch upon the questions that began to trouble Pilate. How could a preacher gather such enormous crowds of people without weapons and aggression? And why was there something in his words that made people ponder the meaning of life and faith? Thus begins the story that Pilate could not ignore. A story that would lead him to a decision that, as he understood, had enormous consequences not only for Judea but for the entire Roman Empire. Are you ready to continue this journey with Pilate and discover what truly happened in those days when Jesus of Nazareth was tried before the Roman authorities? Chapter 2. A time of doubts and anxieties. Have you ever wondered what might happen if a person endowed with absolute power begins to doubt their decision? In Judea, Pontius Pilate faced precisely this situation. His duty was simple: to maintain Roman order and suppress any threats. But how do you deal with someone who does not raise a sword but can make thousands of people consider another path? This was an unusual threat. Jesus of Nazareth. Imagine a restless Judea, where various sects, schools, and teachings competed for the minds and souls of the people. Temple priests, Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, all sought power, each in their own way. And into this chaos entered Jesus, a man who did not belong to any of these groups but gradually attracted thousands of followers. He did not raise a hand against Rome, nor did he call for armed rebellion, yet for some reason, people began to follow him. This started to concern not only the religious elites but also the Roman authorities. Pilate was a pragmatist. He knew how to deal with riots and uprisings, but the situation with Jesus was different. Pilate saw that this was not just another agitator calling for the overthrow of Roman rule. Unlike the Zealots, who openly opposed Rome, Jesus spoke of the kingdom of God. But what did these words have to do with power and order? What was the threat in these preachings of mercy, forgiveness, and love for one's neighbor? For Pilate, it was a paradox. Can you imagine how difficult it was to govern a province like Judea? Its population was restless, the city was boiling with passions, and any spark could ignite a rebellion. Pilate understood that any action he took could lead to disaster, and his resources were limited. His army was small, and support from Syria was minimal. Therefore, he sought peace at any cost, but this peace was fragile. The high priests and leaders of the people of Judea, like Caiaphas, began to pressure Pilate. They were worried about Jesus. The Gospels of Matthew and Mark state that they started accusing Jesus of undermining Roman authority, although they themselves understood that Jesus was more a threat to their own religious power. If you do not stop him, they told Pilate, it will lead to a riot. And Pilate knew that a riot was something that could not be allowed. Pilate also knew that Tiberius was closely watching his decisions. The emperor would not tolerate failures in such important provinces as Judea. Imagine a letter sent from Jerusalem to Rome. Governor Pilate has failed to maintain peace. A rebellion has begun. This would be tantamount to a death sentence. Pilate had already seen how other governors lost their positions, even their lives, for failures in managing provinces. He could not afford mistakes, but what to do with Jesus? Strange accusations were brought against him. He called himself King of the Jews, claiming that his kingdom was not of this world, John 18 verse 36. However, these words did not carry an obvious threat to Rome. They were more spiritual than political, but the religious leaders insisted that Jesus represented danger. They demanded crucifixion. Can you imagine the internal conflict Pilate faced? Before him stood a man who seemed harmless. Even during the interrogation, Jesus did not defend himself or ask for mercy. He calmly answered questions, sometimes remaining silent when Pilate awaited responses. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked, John 18 verse 33. Jesus replied, "You say so," Matthew 27 verse 11. This was not the answer of a rebel or a power-hungry man. But why then were the leaders of the people so desperately seeking his death? Pilate was a man who was used to reading people. He saw that Jesus was not a threat to Rome and wanted to set him free. The Gospel of Luke mentions that Pilate tried 3 times to convince the crowd and the high priests that he found no guilt in Jesus, Luke 23 verse 22. He even sent him to King Herod, hoping he would make a decision. But Herod, mocking Jesus, sent him back. Time was passing, and the situation was only escalating. Pilate could assume that Jesus was just another preacher, of which there were many in Judea. But why then did thousands follow him? Something in his teachings captivated the minds and hearts of the people. Something that troubled the Jews but seemed harmless to Rome. But was it really so? Have you ever wondered what Pilate felt at that moment when he was surrounded by political intrigues, pressure from religious leaders, and a crowd demanding blood? Pilate was at a crossroads. On one hand, he saw no threat in Jesus, but on the other hand, he understood that if he did not meet the demands of the high priests and the crowd, it could lead to disorder. Any mistake could result in catastrophe. As a man accustomed to power, he knew his decision had to be precise. And at that moment, he faced a choice, not just political but moral. Thus, Pilate found himself in a situation where his next actions could change not only the fate of Judea but also the course of history for the entire world. Can you imagine the pressure he felt? The question before him was much deeper than it seemed at first glance. Chapter 3. The choice between truth and power. Can you picture a moment when you face a choice that determines lives? Not just one person, but an entire nation, and perhaps the future of an entire region. Pilate found himself in such a situation, where one misstep could ruin his career and undermine the fragile peace he had worked so hard to maintain in Judea. Pilate knew the rules of the game. He understood how to work with the crowd, how to manipulate the leaders, and make the right decisions for the sake of the empire. But before him stood not merely a rebel or a criminal. He confronted a man whose words and actions could disrupt even the usual rhythm of politicians like Pilate. Can you imagine what his dilemma was? Jesus did not make speeches about overthrowing Roman authority. There were no calls for violence or revolution. On the contrary, his teaching was about forgiveness, humility, and love for one's enemies. These ideas seemed strange to a man of power like Pilate. What could possibly threaten Rome in such teachings? And it appeared that Jesus did not intend to seize power in the conventional sense. But alas, the high priests demanded his death. In the Gospel of Matthew, 27:19, there is an interesting moment. Pilate receives a message from his wife, who sends him a warning. She had a dream about Jesus being a righteous man and urged Pilate not to get involved in this trial. Imagine that even at such a moment, Pilate receives a sign from above. His clearly distressed wife implores him to have nothing to do with this man. This adds a new layer of tension to his internal conflict, but the crowd in the square grew increasingly unruly. The leaders of the people, the high priests and Pharisees, skillfully manipulated the crowd, demanding that Jesus be crucified. They knew that Pilate, as a representative of Rome, could not ignore the pressure from the people. After all, if he did not act, it could lead to civil unrest, and Tiberius would not tolerate disorder in the provinces. As a ruler, Pilate needed to maintain peace in the region, but at what cost? Can you imagine how Pilate felt with this growing din? The pressure mounted with each passing minute. The people in the square shouted for execution, but Pilate saw that their demands were based on hatred and envy, not on any genuine threat from Jesus. The Gospel of Mark, 15:10, emphasizes that Pilate was aware Jesus was handed over out of envy. This was not a matter of crime but a struggle for power and influence among the religious leaders. Pilate was faced with a choice. He could free Jesus, knowing his innocence, but risk inciting a riot and losing his authority. He could yield to the high priests and the crowd, condemning a man he believed to be innocent merely to preserve his position. Have you ever wondered what a person feels when they realize that someone's life depends on their decision while they are forced to choose between conscience and duty? Pilate had already tried to soften the verdict. In the Gospel of Luke, 23:16, Pilate suggested punishing Jesus and releasing him, hoping that would calm the crowd. But his compromise failed. The people continued to demand crucifixion. On that day in the square, there was another prisoner, Barabbas, a man who truly posed a threat to Rome. Barabbas was a rebel, a murderer, an insurrectionist. Pilate offered the crowd a choice. Whom do they want him to release? Jesus, who is called Christ, or Barabbas? The choice seemed obvious. But the people, incited by the high priests, chose Barabbas. How could this happen? What made the people prefer a criminal over a prophet? Imagine the growing anxiety for Pilate. He proposed a logical solution but faced the irrational fury of the crowd. The Gospel of John, 19:12, states that at this moment the high priests began to directly threaten Pilate, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend." This was a direct blow to his political standing. The crowd and the leaders declared that Jesus allegedly claimed the title of king, which was a blatant provocation against Roman authority. And if Pilate did not deal with the new king, he might find himself labeled a traitor to Tiberius. Can you imagine how difficult it was for Pilate at that moment? On one hand, he faced a man whom he believed had committed no crime. On the other, there was a crowd demanding death, and he knew that ignoring them risked his career and possibly his life. The question was not just about Jesus but of his own fate, and at that moment, when the tension reached its peak, Pilate took a step that would be remembered forever. He took water, washed his hands before the crowd and said, "I am innocent of this righteous man's blood. It is your responsibility." Matthew 27 verse 24. This was a symbolic gesture, a refusal to take responsibility for Jesus' death. Pilate understood that he could no longer hold back the crowd and the religious leaders. But deep down, he knew that this decision was wrong, thus, the choice was made. Not because Jesus truly posed a threat, but because power and politics proved stronger than truth and justice. Can you imagine whether at that moment Pilate felt relief or, on the contrary, pain and doubt about his decision? This day marked the beginning of the end for Jesus, but also a time of deep crisis for Pilate. The choice was made, but was it the right one? History will tell. Chapter 4. The consequences of the decision. The crucified king. Have you ever thought about what happens after a difficult decision is made? What does a person feel when it seems that everything has been done, but the consequences of their actions are just beginning to unfold? Pontius Pilate, by washing his hands and refusing to take responsibility for Jesus' fate, made his choice. But this decision was only the beginning of a chain of events that would change his life. Judea, and even the world. Imagine a crowd rejoicing as Pilate announces that Jesus will be crucified. People are cheering, and the priests are watching with satisfaction as their plan comes to fruition. However, Pilate felt no relief. He knew this decision was not just. It was a political maneuver, made to maintain order and his power. Yet within him was a feeling that he had just become part of something far greater than a simple trial. The soldiers received orders to prepare Jesus for execution. Roman crucifixion was one of the most brutal forms of punishment. Crucifixion was reserved for the most dangerous criminals, those who openly challenged the authority of Rome. It served as a warning to all who would consider following their path. Yet, in this case, there was no armed rebel, no conspirator seeking to overturn the power. Instead, there was a man whose words and actions challenged not so much Rome, but the hearts of the people. The Gospel of John, 19:1-3, describes how the soldiers mocked Jesus. They placed a crown of thorns on his head and dressed him in a purple robe, jeering, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck him and spat on him. For them, it was just another day on the job. They had seen many rebels go to the cross, but Jesus was different. He remained silent. He did not curse his enemies or scream in horror. Can you imagine how unusual this must have seemed even to those accustomed to violence? Meanwhile, Pilate continued to observe the proceedings. He did what he thought was necessary to maintain order. But was it the right thing? The Gospel of John, 19:4-6, states that Pilate tried to present Jesus to the crowd again after his scourging, hoping it would be enough. He brought Jesus out and said, "Behold the man." Perhaps Pilate hoped that the pitiful sight of the beaten Jesus would evoke pity in the crowd. But it did not happen. The religious leaders and the crowd continued to shout, "Crucify him." Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be powerless at the moment when all your efforts prove to be in vain? Pilate realized he was losing control of the situation. The religious leaders and the crowd were stronger than his authority. This was not just the crucifixion of another criminal. It was something more. He saw that in front of him was unfolding a dramatic, symbolic scene where he was merely a pawn in someone else's game. Jesus was led to Golgotha, the place of execution. His cross was heavy, and according to tradition, Jesus could not carry it all the way. They called upon Simon of Cyrene, Luke 23 verse 26, a passerby who had to share this burden with Jesus. Can you imagine what it was like for this man to suddenly find himself at the center of one of history's most tragic events? He was not a disciple of Jesus, he was not a participant in this drama, but fate made him part of the journey to Golgotha. At Golgotha, towering over Jerusalem, 3 crosses were prepared. Jesus was crucified between 2 criminals. This was symbolic. Roman authority placed him in the same category as ordinary rebels and bandits. Yet even at this moment, something was unusual. The Gospel of Luke, 23:34, describes how Jesus, hanging on the cross, uttered words that astonished many, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He did not curse his executioners. He prayed for their forgiveness. Have you ever thought about how such words would sound in the ears of those standing at the foot of the cross? The soldiers, accustomed to brutality, could not understand how a man who had suffered such horrendous torment could speak of forgiveness. The crowd that demanded his crucifixion fell silent in bewilderment. How could this be? Who was this man who did not respond to evil with evil? Pilate, sitting in his palace, surely heard news of what was happening at Golgotha. He may have expected everything to end as usual, death on a cross, then the bodies would be removed, and life would return to normal. But something in this situation told him that this crucifixion was different from others. The Romans had crucified thousands, but this man's name was destined to be remembered for centuries. An important symbol emerged when Pilate ordered a sign placed above Jesus' head reading, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," John 19 verse 19. The chief priests were outraged and demanded the inscription read. He said, "I am the King of the Jews." But Pilate, as if deciding to leave his mark on this story, replied, "What I have written, I have written." This was his quiet protest against the pressure he had succumbed to earlier. Pilate knew that there was a certain truth in this sign, regardless of everything. Can you imagine how this simple act of placing a sign became an important symbol? Even the chief priests, who had orchestrated the crucifixion, could not bear the idea of Jesus being called a king. But Pilate, almost inadvertently, recognized in this gesture something greater than mere mockery. He saw that there was something more profound behind this man, something that would haunt him even after his death, and so, the crucifixion took place. Jesus died on the cross. It seemed the story was over. Pilate could return to his affairs, the crowd would disperse, and Jerusalem would return to its routine life. But Pilate perhaps understood that everything was just beginning. The quiet words of Jesus, his forgiveness for his enemies, and the inscription above his head, all these left a mark on his soul. Can you imagine that Pilate, a man accustomed to power and control, was now questioning whether he had made the greatest mistake of his life? But what happened next? What awaited Pilate after that fateful day? After the death of Jesus, everything around seemed to plunge into a heavy, ominous silence. Even nature appeared to react to this event. The Gospel of Matthew, 27:45, states that from the 6th hour, around noon, to the 9th hour, approximately 3 in the afternoon, darkness fell over the whole land. Can you imagine how this gloomy sign affected the people present at Golgotha? The crowd, which had just been rejoicing, now stood in bewilderment, and fear gradually filled their hearts. But the most incredible thing happened at the moment of Jesus' death. Matthew describes how the veil of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split, Matthew 27 verse 51. This veil separated the holy place from the most holy place in the temple, and its tearing was not just a physical phenomenon. It became a symbol that there was now no longer a barrier between God and man. It was a sign that even the religious leaders could not ignore. Imagine that Pilate, in his residence, was receiving reports of what was happening in Jerusalem. The earthquake, the tearing of the temple veil, the strange darkness, everything looked like signs. Can you envision how his anxiety escalated? He simply wanted to appease the crowd and maintain his power, but instead, events took on a mystical turn that he could not control. The Gospel of Matthew, 27:54, mentions that even the Roman soldiers standing at the cross were struck by what was happening. The centurion in charge of the execution, seeing the earthquake and everything that was occurring, said, "Truly this was the Son of God." Can you imagine what this battle-hardened warrior, who seemed indifferent to religious disputes, was feeling? His words reflected the shock that engulfed all the witnesses of this drama. Meanwhile, one of the prominent men of Judea, Joseph of Arimathea, approached Pilate. The Gospel of John, 19:38-42, describes how this man, a secret disciple of Jesus, asked Pilate for permission to take the body of Jesus down from the cross and bury it. This was not just a gesture of respect for Joseph and his companions, it was important to give the body of their teacher a dignified burial. Pilate may have already been morally exhausted after the events of that day. He granted Joseph permission, unaware that this would begin a new, remarkable chapter in history. The body of Jesus was taken down from the cross, wrapped in burial cloths, and placed in a new tomb that Joseph had prepared for himself. The burial was carried out quietly, without ostentation, under the cover of night. But the story did not end there. Can you imagine what the atmosphere in Jerusalem was like during those days? The murder of Jesus was supposed to mark the end of his movement, the end of all disturbances. But instead, the city was engulfed in unease and expectation. Even those who had not followed him felt that something unusual had occurred. Pilate also understood that this event would go beyond a mere execution. He knew that Jesus' body could not be left unguarded. Rumors of his resurrection were already circulating among the people. The Gospel of Matthew, 27:62-66, recounts that the chief priests came to Pilate the day after the crucifixion, requesting that a guard be stationed at the tomb. They feared that Jesus' disciples might steal the body and proclaim that he had risen from the dead, which could lead to an even greater uprising among the people. Pilate agreed, assigning a Roman guard and ordering the tomb to be sealed. This was supposed to put an end to all rumors and prevent possible provocations. But, as we know, things did not go as planned. Can you imagine Pilate's reaction when he received word that Jesus' body had disappeared? On the third day after the burial, the tomb was found empty, and the soldiers guarding it reported that something incredible had happened. According to them, there had been a strong earthquake during the night, and an angel descended from heaven, rolled away the stone from the entrance of the tomb, and Jesus' body was gone. Matthew 28:2-4. Have you ever wondered what Pilate felt at that moment? He had done everything he could to control the situation. He stationed guards, sealed the tomb, and took all necessary precautions. But all his efforts proved futile. The body was gone. The soldiers, fearing the consequences, might have fled, but they went to the chief priests, who immediately understood that action was necessary. The chief priests paid the soldiers a large bribe so that they would spread the rumor that Jesus' disciples had stolen his body by night. Matthew 28:12-15. For Pilate, this rumor was convenient. He did not want to believe in the miracle of resurrection. He was a man accustomed to political intrigues and manipulations, and it was easier for him to imagine that this was just a clever trick by Jesus' followers. But deep down, Pilate understood that everything had spiraled out of control. Can you imagine how agonizing it was for him to realize that despite all his efforts, the story did not end as he had planned? Pilate may have thought that Jesus' death on the cross would resolve all issues. But instead, he found himself entangled in an event that continued to unfold and that would be talked about for centuries to come. Chapter 5. The mystery of the empty tomb. What happened? Have you ever wondered what you would do if you were in Pilate's position at the moment when he was informed about the empty tomb? Imagine this. You have already rid yourself of the biggest headache. You executed a man who threatened order in your region. You thought it was all over. But suddenly, you are told that his body has disappeared, and there are rumors that he has risen from the dead. Isn't it true that the situation seems both mystical and alarming? The Gospels recount how, on the third day after the burial, women, Mary Magdalene and others, Mark 16:1-8, Luke 24:1-12, went to the tomb. They intended to anoint Jesus' body with spices, as tradition required. But when they arrived, the stone had been rolled away, and the tomb was empty. The words of the angel who appeared to them were shocking. "He has risen, he is not here." Can you imagine their astonishment and fear? The women did not expect to find an empty tomb. They came to mourn the dead, but instead encountered a great miracle. Meanwhile, Pilate was receiving distressing news from his men. The soldiers who had been guarding the tomb fled in fear after witnessing supernatural events. According to them, an earthquake and the appearance of an angel-like being paralyzed them. These soldiers were not faint-hearted, they were battle-hardened Roman legionnaires. Yet even they could not withstand what was happening. Can you imagine how confused Pilate must have been? A situation was unfolding before his eyes that he could not make sense of. He was a man of power, an official of the Roman Empire, accustomed to controlling everything through force and manipulation. But something was happening here that was beyond his understanding. The body of Jesus had disappeared, and rumors of his resurrection were spreading throughout Jerusalem. As a politician, Pilate knew that such rumors could lead to a new wave of unrest. The chief priests, recognizing the threat, quickly moved to act. They offered the soldiers money for silence and devised a story to spread among the people. "His disciples came during the night and stole his body while we were asleep." Matthew 28 verses 12 to 15. Have you ever thought about how ill-conceived this story was? Roman soldiers, being disciplined and strictly following orders, couldn't afford to sleep on watch, and for such violations, they could be executed. However, this lie was advantageous for Pilate as well. He did not want further unrest in Judea. For him, it was easier to agree with the chief priest's explanation than to entertain the possibility that something supernatural had occurred. Pilate wanted to put an end to this story. But could he, deep down, believe such an obvious lie? Imagine Pilate sitting in his palace, contemplating what had happened. He had done everything to bring the situation to a close: the crucifixion, the guards, the seals on the tomb. But everything had spiraled out of his control. Jesus, the man he had executed, continued to impact people even after his death. It seemed that his death had not been an end but the beginning of something greater. Can you envision Pilate pondering who this Jesus truly was? He had seen him as an unusual man, a preacher who called for no rebellion but evoked mass admiration among the people. But now, with the body gone, Pilate was likely beginning to realize that this matter was not simply political or religious. He was confronted with something that defied his logic. The empty tomb became the source of numerous rumors. Some said that Jesus' disciples had indeed stolen the body to deceive the people. Others claimed that he had really risen, just as he had predicted. The rumors spread throughout Jerusalem, and Pilate may have begun to understand that the crucifixion of Jesus had not resolved the issue but rather intensified it. The Gospels tell us that after the resurrection, Jesus began to appear to his disciples. He appeared before Mary Magdalene, John 20 verses 11 to 18, and then before Peter and the other apostles, Luke 24 verses 36 to 43. Can you imagine the shock and fear of the disciples, who had been devastated after his death, suddenly finding themselves face to face with the resurrected Jesus? It must have been a profound revelation. They had seen him crucified and dead, yet now he stood before them, alive. Meanwhile, Pilate continued to go about his life, trying to ignore the escalating rumors. But within him, perhaps, anxiety was growing. He understood that the decision he had made was not a simple one. Can you imagine how for many long nights he pondered the possibility that he had become part of not just a political decision, but an event that would change the course of history? But what could Pilate do now? The official version that the body had been stolen was already circulating among the people. He could not admit that something greater had occurred, as that would undermine his authority and provoke new unrest. Yet within him, he was likely realizing that he had become part of a grand drama unfolding before his eyes. As a politician, Pilate understood that the situation was becoming unstable. But as a man, He may have been asking himself, who was this Jesus, really? The man he executed was not a revolutionary, yet his influence on the people proved far stronger than any weapon or uprising. What next? How would the crucifixion of Jesus and the rumors of his resurrection change the fate of Judea and Pilate himself? Chapter 6. Uprising or New Faith? Have you ever wondered what goes through the mind of a leader when events unfold contrary to their plan? Can you imagine what it's like to try to maintain control of a situation when reality itself begins to contradict your logic? This is precisely what Pontius Pilate faced after the disappearance of Jesus' body. Like any Roman governor, he was confident in his power and influence. But now he was confronted with the question, what next? After the resurrection of Jesus, a new wave of enthusiasm began to emerge among his followers. The disciples, who had been frightened and scattered on the night of his arrest, started to come together again. In their hearts, a new hope arose. Jesus is alive, and his words about the kingdom of God became even more real. Can you imagine the reaction of the high priests, who thought they had put an end to this problem with the crucifixion of Jesus? Now his teachings had become even more powerful. The Acts of the Apostles, Acts 2 verses 1-4, describes how on Pentecost, just a few weeks after the resurrection, the disciples of Jesus received the Holy Spirit. This event became a turning point for the new movement. Suddenly, people who had previously feared for their lives began to preach openly. The Apostle Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times during his arrest, now stood before a crowd in Jerusalem and proclaimed that Jesus had risen from the dead and was the Messiah they had long awaited. Imagine the authorities' reaction. The high priests, who believed it was all over, now faced the reality that Jesus' influence was spreading even faster than before. But for Pilate, the situation had become even more dangerous. He was a Roman ruler in a region where any uprising could cost him his career, and possibly his life. Can you envision how Pilate monitored events, observing the rise of this new sect? For him, it was not just a religious movement, it was a political threat. Although Jesus' followers did not call for an uprising against Rome, their belief in a king who had been crucified but was now said to be alive was concerning. In the Roman Empire, there was no place for competition in matters of power. The emperor was the supreme ruler, and anyone who challenged that position represented a threat to stability. Nevertheless, Pilate was shrewd. He understood that repression could lead to a new wave of violence. The disciples of Jesus were not ordinary rebels. They did not advocate for armed insurrection or plot conspiracies. But their faith was stronger than swords. The faith that compelled them to speak of the resurrection of Christ, of salvation, and of a new kingdom was unstoppable. You can imagine how Pilate, accustomed to resolving issues through violence and force, faced something that could not be suppressed. At that moment, perhaps Pilate realized that the crucifixion of Jesus was not the end, but the beginning of something much larger. The teachings of Jesus, which he had tried to halt, were now spreading throughout Jerusalem and beyond. The Acts of the Apostles, Acts 2 verse 41, states that on one day, about 3,000 people joined the disciples. This was not merely a movement of believers, it had become a true social phenomenon. Imagine how Pilate felt receiving reports that crowds of people were listening to these disciples, that their numbers were growing, and that they were preaching the resurrection of the crucified Jesus. For him, it was like the explosion of a slow-moving bomb. He understood perfectly that any mass movement, especially one tied to faith, is difficult to control. Faith does not conform to the laws of logic and power. Pilate, of course, could not ignore what was happening. But he also could not simply seize all the followers of Jesus and execute them, like he had done with their teacher. This time, the situation was much more nuanced. The Romans knew that harsh repression could have the opposite effect. Martyrs often became symbols around which movements were built. Such was the case with Jesus, and Pilate likely feared that repeating this scenario would result in an even greater expansion of the movement. Meanwhile, the disciples themselves realized they were witnesses to the fulfillment of prophecies. They saw what had happened not merely as historical events but as divine intervention. For them, the resurrection of Jesus meant victory over death and the promise of eternal life. Their faith was strengthened with each passing day, making them impervious to fear. But what could Pilate do? As a Roman governor, he was limited in his actions. He needed to maintain peace in the province, where every step could lead to a new uprising. On the one hand, he could not ignore the growing movement of Jesus' followers. On the other hand, he knew that any wrong move could lead to disaster. Can you imagine how he sought balance? How deep down? Pilate may have wondered who this Jesus really was, the one he had crucified. After all, everyone he had condemned to death before faded from history, their names erased by time. But this man, whom he thought to be a political rebel, was now becoming a figure whose influence was growing each day. Thanks to their faith and conviction, the disciples of Jesus began to spread their message throughout the region. Jerusalem could no longer contain them. In the Acts of the Apostles, Acts 8 verse 4, it is described how they started preaching throughout Judea and Samaria, and later even further into pagan lands. Pilate saw that the movement had become not just a local issue, it was beginning to capture the hearts of people far beyond Jerusalem. And perhaps in these moments, Pilate began to understand that his role in this story was merely a footnote in a much greater narrative. But could he have imagined that this movement, which began with a few followers, would soon encompass the entire Roman Empire? Could he fathom that, centuries later, this very faith would become the official religion of the very empire he served? But at that moment, Pilate likely realized one thing: the crucifixion of Jesus did not stop his teachings, it merely gave impetus to their spread. Have you ever thought about the legacy Pilate left behind? How the crucifixion of Jesus and the subsequent faith in his resurrection changed not only the fate of a people but the very course of human history. In those moments, he became part of a great drama that rewrote the pages of history. The uprising of Jesus led to a new faith that, paradoxically, arose from his death. Chapter 7. Lessons of time: what remains after Pilate? Have you ever wondered what legacy is left behind by people who play a key role in history? What are the consequences of their decisions, and can they predetermine the fates of entire nations? Imagine a historical drama that unfolded in Jerusalem over 2,000 years ago, where a man who ultimately found himself merely a puppet in the hands of a greater power played a crucial role. Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea who sentenced Jesus, became a symbol of inaction in the face of true evil. His decision, to wash his hands of the fate of the man who was crucified but later resurrected, turned into a landmark moment in human history. Picture how his story, captured in the pages of the Gospels, has become a warning for many rulers and individuals over time. How could mistakes have been avoided had Pilate acted differently? What if he had not allowed fear and political ambition to overshadow his sense of justice? As a result of his hesitation and indecision, the teachings of Jesus began to spread around the world. This new faith, which started with a small group of followers, soon encompassed the whole of Rome, then Europe, and ultimately the entire world. Can you imagine how Pilate, though remembered in history as the figure who washed his hands, became part of the greatest spiritual movement that transformed the consciousness of millions? Jesus, crucified and resurrected, became a symbol of hope and salvation, while Pilate remained in the shadows, lost in centuries of debates and reflections on his choice. Now, as we remember the events that took place in Jerusalem, we should ask ourselves important questions. How do we respond to the truth when it does not align with our understanding of the world? How can we know when to act and when it is better to let things be? Ultimately, Pilate became a victim of his own lack of courage, leading history down a path he could not have imagined. Can you envision how the course of history might have changed had Pilate chosen differently? What if he had resisted the pressure of the crowd and the authorities, and instead opted for the path of justice? In his case, this would have been difficult, as he was a hostage to his power and circumstances. But that is precisely what makes his story so instructive. It serves as a warning for all of us about the importance of the choices we make in response to pressure, societal expectations, and our own fears. In recent centuries, his story has become a lesson. It teaches us about the significance of resilience and the necessity of standing up for our beliefs, even when the world around us tries to confuse us. Pilate could have become an ally of Jesus, but instead, he chose the path of least resistance. And thus, in the end, he is remembered as one who failed to recognize the true value that stood before him. Consequently, Pilate is a figure whose fate, much like that of Jesus, became part of a grand narrative that fostered change in human consciousness. In this story, each of us can find a reflection. Every individual can ask themselves, what will I do when I confront the truth? The path of Jesus is not only a story of sacrifice but also one of hope, a belief that even in the darkest moments, light can be found. So, what remains after Pilate? The faith awakened in the hearts of people changed the world. While his name remained a symbol of doubt and indecision. Perhaps this is the lesson of our time. History is not just about great feats but also about how small choices can have significant consequences. Now, as we look back at events that happened over 2,000 years ago, we see not only a story of crucifixion and resurrection but also an eternal lesson for all of us about courage, justice, and truth. Pilate became part of this story, but we must ask ourselves, what is our role in the ongoing narrative? How can we choose truth, even when the world around us seems murky and uncertain? And perhaps therein lies the essence. Each of us can become part of something greater. Each of us can make a choice that will impact the world around us. Which path will you choose?